options there and have simultaneous translation. Also, if you have questions for the panelists, you can pop those in the chat box. And also the whole event is being recorded today, and we'll be sending a link of the recording round after the session. So I'd like to introduce James Baker, who is going to be the chair of our final panel today. James is a third-year PhD candidate in history here at the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull. So as we're running slightly behind time, I'll hand over straight to James without further ado. Thank you, James.
Thanks very much, Saphia. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final panel of the day. As Saphia mentioned, my name is James, and I will be chairing this panel concerning conflict, disaster, and migration. We've got three excellent papers from Ritu Bharadwaj, from the International Institute for Environment and Development, Chris O'Connell from Dublin City University, and Saphia Fleury from the University of Hull. So as Saphia mentioned, as always, if you have any questions about today's papers, please do put them in the chat and they'll endeavour to answer them either in person or written down after their presentations have finished. So our first speaker of this panel is Ritu Bharadwaj, who'll be presenting her paper, a summary of the IIED report on slavery, climate change and migration. Ritu has more than 18 years of senior policy development, research and management experience in government, funding agencies and international NGOs. She has worked extensively on climate resilience, resource conservation, social protection, migration and gender issues. Over the years, her work has helped develop robust evidence-based research that has influenced policy framework and strategies for numerous institutions and organizations, including national governments, international development, and humanitarian organizations. Her experience spans across issues of climate change, disaster risk reduction, and migration, and how it interacts with climate-induced migration. She has particular understanding on how to align development and social protection programs to prevent climate-induced displacement and distress migration. Having provided leadership on policy and program design, she is an important resource in the think tank of several institutions, particularly with government agencies, where she has contributed to the overall strategy, learning and advocacy agendas. So I'll now hand over to Ritu for her paper.
Thanks, James. It's very embarrassing to hear your own introduction. So anyways, I'll go on to more useful stuff now. Firstly, so, I have to honestly say that in so many years of my experience, this was one of the most exciting research that I carried out. And trying to figure out the nexus between climate change, migration, and modern slavery. And this was just not my effort. There were so many other researchers from across Ghana and Challenging Heights partnered with us. We had another consultant, Somnath Hazra, who collaborated with us from Sundarbans area. So essentially, within our research, we tried to figure out how this nexus actually exists. And we figured out that, at least in three circumstances, this nexus definitely exists, or there are three circumstances in which we found that this nexus to be existing. Firstly, was in context of sudden and extreme climatic events like cyclones or floods or hurricanes, which leads to displacement of community, and that exposes them to different forms of slavery. And by far, we found that within the literature, within the research area, this was one of the most well-documented pathways that we saw existed. There was very strong evidence indicating that human trafficking increases in the aftermath of such sudden onset disasters or extreme events. And there are several examples I can quote. For example, Typhoon Haiya in Philippines, which has been most well documented and most widely quoted. But there are many more examples like this. For example, in Bangladesh, women who were left widowed by Cyclone Sidr were targeted by traffickers and driven into prostitution and hard labor. And similarly, from my own country in India, in the aftermath of flooding in Assam in northeastern India, women and girls were particularly forced into child slavery and forced marriages to make ends meet. So this is the first pathway indicating that nexus in the aftermath of sudden and extreme climatic events. Now, the second pathway where we saw that this nexus or this linkage between climate migration and slavery existed was the slow onset event. For example, those like drought or desertification. And this pathway exists when climate variability, such as increasing variability in rainfall or higher than normal temperatures, that leads to drought-like situation and resulting in crop or pasture loss or drinking water shortage or food insecurity. And situations like these pushes communities which are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods to look for alternate sources of subsistence. And in absence of viable local options or safety net, these communities are left with no option but to pursue dangerous or risky coping strategies which, for example, like incurring debt or trying to pursue risky migration opportunities, which often leads them into slavery-like situation. And the most well-known research in this space, I'm sure all of you know, is with regard to blood bricks, which was documented this practice in Cambodia, which mapped intricate details of how farmers whose livelihoods have been undermined by climate change, they're forced into intergenerational debt bondage and so on. So this was the second pathway. And the third pathway where we saw this nexus to be existing was when slow onset events, when they combine with conflict and forced displacement. And this final pathway normally exists in case of large-scale incremental forced displacement due to conflict, which is precipitated further by slow onset natural disasters like drought or famine-like situations. And typically, we've seen that when conflict affects a certain area, they weaken the existing institutions, markets, or livelihood support system, which under normal circumstances could have provided a safety net to community. But in absence, in conflict situation, these systems or support mechanisms are not available, and that takes away the means of a community to probably adapt, cope, or recover from climate shocks and stresses. And the resulting income loss or displacement or higher levels of food insecurity then forces community to, again, pursue risky coping strategy, which lands them into bondage or slavery-like situation. But in each of these three pathways that I talked about, they don't exist in isolation. They often overlap and intersect. And in conclusion, we can say that and we further try to understand these three pathways, how they exist and how they emancipate or how they evolve, is we did two case studies, one in Ghana, and I see Enoch is also present today. So I'll be very happy if you can share some details. He'll be happy to respond to some of your questions based on the case study we did in Ghana and also another case study that we did for Sundarbans. But in each of these case studies or the three pathways that I just talked about, one thing is very clear, that climate change is worsening poverty and inequality and placing people who are already in precarious situation in position where they reach the limits of coping capacity. And they're then exposed into other impacts like slavery. Slavery is just one form that this forced displacement or distress migration is leading to. There are there are a host of other issues that it is creating, which is, beyond slavery as well. And the second is that the links between climate change, migration, and modern slavery, and something that Chris also highlighted when he was reviewing our paper, was that these issues are rooted in the power in social relations. So you can't, it's somehow the traditional marginalization and the inequity in the society, it's at the root of all these, root of this nexus that exists between the climate change, migration, and modern slavery. So if I just have 2 more minutes, James, I'll just quickly go into some of the recommendations that we came out as a result of this this case study assessment and these three pathways. One, we wanted policymakers to work out targeted actions, both at national as well as international level, to address this issue in the most vulnerable population. And for them, we said that first they need to recognize this as a priority issue, both for development as well as for the climate, and integrate these priorities into the existing urban and rural climate resilience plans, migration response plan, or the national development plan. Second, COP26 is coming, and we seriously want UNFCCC to consider having firm and targeted action on this issue in line with what we have in Sustainable Development Goal. Third, we want coordinate, because we know there are a lot of action happening on each of these three issues that I mentioned within the Sendai framework, within Task Force of Displacement that has been created under the UNFCCC or SDG and others. What we need is a coordinated action which tries to deal with this nexus between climate, migration, and slavery. Fourth, we also want that these policy interventions should be based on local research and evidence. We should try to make effort for strengthening the existing social safety nets. And finally, I would say that we can't prevent migration. There are some climate impacts that are already logged in, and there is no way we'll be able to prevent those climate impacts from happening. So what we need to see that people who are along the coastal area, people who are dealing with sea level rise and other impacts of climate, whether we can create take anticipatory measures or preventive measures or advanced planning and relocation to resettle and these displaced communities, so that they are not, when they're not placed in situation where they are forced to migrate or they are in a distress situation. Rather, there is an advanced planning to relocate and resettle them in safer areas. So I'll just stop there, James, and I'll be happy to respond to any question, query, or further input that you might need.
It's an excellent paper, thank you, and a great insight into sort of the gendered experience of sort of climate change and forced migration. It does touch upon what we heard from earlier on with Wilma about harnessing the sort of local knowledge that often gets kind of overlooked in these discussions. So thank you very much. And we've got two questions that speak to the sort of the gendered kind of aspects and the sort of suffering of women and children in this particular field. So the first question comes from Tanya Jennings. Thank you very much. Who asks about your research and says, are studies also looking at forced marriage following illegal immigration or seeking amnesty or refugee status in the UK or the US?
Yes, and I also see there's another question around throwing some light on Dalit, Adivasi, and excluded. So yes, as I said, so first, forced marriages we have seen even in India, and even in Bangladesh, in Sundarban's case study that we did. The first thing that a family does when they are exposed to climate crisis is they try to, and it's the girl child who becomes the biggest liability for the family. And so they either, end up getting forced early marriages, or they're even sold off sometimes. So these situations, they do exist, but we also need to understand the context in which these are happening. And we can't just blame the family. There are sometimes the situation is such that they are left with no option. So yes, that's a situation there. But if I answer the second question that I just see there is, yes, something which I also mentioned, there are two very stark conclusions that we can draw from our research. One is climate change is a stress multiplier to the existing vulnerabilities that people are already facing. And these vulnerabilities, the second one is, these vulnerabilities are rooted in social dynamics. So the people like Adivasis, the indigenous people, the Dalits, who have traditionally been marginalized, they become more vulnerable to climate impacts of forced migration or displacement. So that historical marginalization it gets reflected in the climate vulnerabilities as well. So yes, that's a situation. So when we are talking about this nexus, we have to be conscious of those historical marginalization within our strategy.
Excellent response. And if I may kind of use my kind of chair's privilege, if I may, to ask a question about kind of your overall experience. And you mentioned a lot about the suffering of women and children. And I guess in your kind of 18 years or so, have there been any kind of major kind of policy changes or any kind of major kind of, I guess, shifts in sort of policy regarding the protection of these groups? Or is there still a kind of a lack of development kind of internationally about protecting these groups in a kind of climate-induced kind of context?
See, James, if I start talking about my 18 years of experience, in fact, now 20 years, I would say, see, when I started working with the government setup. And when we talked about gender, the first thing they said was, this whole issue started getting targeted by, let's do gender disaggregated monitoring. Let's get data on what's happening within these existing programs on gender-related impacts. Then came gender-based budgeting, gender-based planning. These programs have evolved over the years, but yes, these are, we are still touching this issue from the outside. We are not really dealing with the hardcore issues. We are not really going into the root cause of these inequalities or iniquities in the society. Because climate is just another layer of issue that women, children, and these marginalized communities are facing. So when we're talking about climate, we have to start with the bottommost issue, and just gender-based budgeting, gender-based targeting, or planning and budgeting, that would not help. We have to. I also work a lot on social protection programs, and we have to start somehow by developing social protection programs which are targeted in a way on these vulnerable groups, whether it is, I saw about Dalits and Adivasis. We also see they're disabled, they are elderly, they are women, they are children. So we need to have social protection safety net programs for these communities or these different vulnerable groups, specifically tailored to their needs and their vulnerabilities. And it cannot be like one size fits all. We come out with, like in India, we have this NGNREGS scheme, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So it's like a one size, like one program. We have this NGNREGS scheme. What else do you need? So we have to go little beyond that. Old age pension schemes, they do help in some way, but they don't help you holistically. So if you have to deal with some of these existing vulnerabilities, these social safety nets have to be more holistic, providing a comprehensive coverage to these vulnerable groups.
No, good answer. Thank you very much. Then we've got time for one final question from the audience. This is from Lee McQueen. Thank you very much for this question. He says, at the national level, at least in India, we see the National Action Plan for Climate Change have little to offer the adaptation and disaster risk reduction packed into development, social protection schemes, has done very little to improve resilience to the most marginalized. Internationally, regionally, and nationally, the actions for disasters and climate change actions are not very coordinated, and seldom they recognize and address pre-existing vulnerabilities. So he asks, how can these aspects be amplified through you, asking for community gender-wise data and measures from the government?
See, even within, we're working, at least in India, we're working with NGNREGS. So when we talk about this scheme, which they say is like, it's almost thrown on your face as a panacea to all the issues that the communities face, whether it's rural distress, agrarian distress, employment issues, livelihood, anything. But nevertheless, one thing that is good about this program is that it allows local level planning. It provides resources in the hands of local community. But what we need is the Act gives that provision to allow for local level planning and local level resource allocation. But what we need is to empower the people so that they have a say in that plan, even though legally they have a say, but how much they actually having a say are two different things. So what we need is, and what we're trying to impress upon the government is, that to make these plans climate resilient, make these programs climate resilient, we need to have anticipatory action. So even with this, within this public works-based wage program, it allows for 100 days of employment. We are saying that if a drought-like situation or a flood-like situation arises, give them anticipatory wages, give them anticipatory, instead of waiting for that disaster to happen and then provide wages later on, extra days of employment later on, it comes in too little and too late. So rather than post facto, we have to do ex ante planning and make sure that climate information is linked with that, anticipatory actions are linked with that, early actions are linked with that. And many of these plans that we make at the village level, at the community level, they're dynamic in nature. They, it should not be, okay, we have to create 2 check dams, 3 cyclone shelters, or, different. Because we know that many of these climate actions, they're increasing in intensity and frequency, many of these impacts are going beyond the limits of adaptation. So it is going beyond the existing capacities on knowledge base or the infrastructure or the existing capacities that community currently has. So you have to keep that planning dynamic so that if the situation such arises in a way that it goes beyond the limits of adaptation, they should be given that option of changing that planning process, making that huge livelihood shift if they need, for skill enhancement, for migration, for planned relocation, and so on. So, intervention from a number of sources would be needed, but we also need, and I don't want to throw jargons in here, but yes, we do need whole of a society approach. Like we have to go a little beyond the way we are doing our conventional planning process. We have to go a little beyond that, do a little bit of business unusual approaches, because we know climate change is not following the business as usual approaches. Climate change is behaving in the most unusual way, unprecedented way, something similar to the way we saw during COVID times. So we do need to be planned for those unprecedented events in advance. So yes.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. I'm afraid I think we've run out of time for any further questions, but I'm sure we'll be able to answer any further comments or queries that happen in the chat. But Ritu, thank you very much for an excellent paper. I've learned a great deal from your research, and look forward to hearing more about your research in the near future. And we'll move on to our second speaker of this panel, Dr. Chris O'Connell, who will discuss his paper, Vulnerable or Vulnerabilized: The Links Between Contemporary Slavery, Climate Change, and Extra Activisms. Dr. Chris O'Connell is a Caroline Research Fellow at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. His current research is co-funded by the European Commission and the Irish Research Council, and focuses on the relationship between and responses to climate change, environmental degradation, and contemporary forms of slavery in Peru and Bolivia. Chris holds a PhD in political science from Dublin City University. So Chris, take it away.
Thanks very much, James. Okay, great, and thanks to Ritu as well. That was great, and I think mine should follow on. My presentation should hopefully follow on nicely from that. So let's see if we get this. Okay, can you see that okay, James?
Yes, that's fine for me. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so thanks everyone for this. So yeah, I'll move on just to say that this photograph depicts a Bolivian family, and it's Bolivia that I'm going to be discussing today, even though my research has looked at Peru as well, whose crop of quinoa has been lost to to drought essential or lack of rainfall. We'll discuss maybe that word drought in a minute. But so this sort of follows on a little bit from what Shannon, excuse me, was talking about in terms of kind of conceptualizations of vulnerability. If we look at the general, I suppose, mainstream approaches to exploitation, vulnerability to exploitation, contemporary slavery, such as the ILO reports, etc., what we tend to see is references to risk factors. So a little bit, as I say, connecting to what Shannon was talking about, issues like poverty, gender, ethnicity, etc., but not a lot of focus on what causes these risks. Why are these factors risky? And I think in recent times this has started to shift. So there's been, I think, as people will know, quite a bit of different sort of literatures around contemporary slavery that have, I think, moved the debate on quite a bit in recent years. And we're starting to see, I think, a more nuanced vision of vulnerability that sees it as related to not absolute poverty, but levels of inequality, and related to that then power imbalances. But I still think that there's still quite a bit of focus on individual relations of power in this literature, as opposed to more structural, more societal or socioeconomic and political forms of power. So we're going to, I'm going to talk a bit about those, and particularly that sort of idea of the individuals, and a sort of a notion. Carolina talked about metaphors earlier, a sort of metaphor of kind of feudal or anachronistic practices. I think there's a UNU report from a few years ago that talked about these vested interests as sustaining these forms of extreme inequality, but referred to things like corrupt officials, unscrupulous business actors. So very much placing it in a sort of exceptionalist framework. Whereas there's other, research, the likes of Leonardo Sakamoto, Andrew Crane, Genevieve Le Baron, who have shown that actually these practices are very much regularized practices and very much linked to profitability in certain sectors. And then there's, I think, an increasing realization in wider human security circles of the need for context when it comes to talking about vulnerability, and particularly that vulnerability to exploitation is mediated by domestic and international factors, including institutional, societal, and political factors. And so it's, that brings me to, focus on the state in terms of its role here. And this has been noted, in the literature as a bit of a blind spot in the literature on contemporary slavery, in part because, more legalistic approaches to contemporary slavery tend to treat the state more or less unproblematically as a creator and enforcer of laws, based on a sort of assumption that the state wants what's best for its median citizen, or along those lines. But I think that we can see from those risk factors and those vulnerabilities that in fact not all citizens are treated equally, and not all are equally vulnerable. In another approach to the state is the more critical approach that sees the state more somewhat unproblematically, again, as an extension of capitalism, that the state will essentially facilitate capitalism. There's certainly a lot of evidence, I think, to support this historically, but nevertheless there are some other examples that we can point to as well. Shannon was talking about the example of Brazil, for example, and so perhaps more nuanced position is to consider the state as contested terrain, and that the role of the state is an ambiguous one, that it can facilitate vulnerability, but it can also mitigate or even eliminate vulnerability. And so, perhaps the question then is, under what circumstances does the state really act? Because ultimately, I acknowledge what Ritu is saying there, and I think those are very strong points about more localized approaches. but ultimately in the context particularly of climate change, but also contemporary slavery, the state is right at the center of global governance. And we can't just sidestep its importance when it comes to tackling these issues. So so this brings me on then to some of the more recent and developing literature, I think, on this nexus between climate change and contemporary slavery. And in fact, I think here we can actually see somewhat of a leadership role in this branch of academia in terms of a more holistic approach. I think perhaps dealing with and engaging with climate change and its systemic nature, like Carolina was talking about earlier, forces us to go beyond ideas of individuals, individual power relations, and to think more holistically. And so we can see that this literature is starting to move beyond to look more at the ideas of push and pull factors. The data and evidence is still emerging, but this is certainly would meet with my my research in this area. And so we can think then perhaps about climate change and vulnerability is also, I think, moving on in terms of a more nuanced position. And this can help inform not only this nexus, but I think perhaps wider approaches to contemporary slavery in terms of where do these vulnerabilities come from. Obviously, when we talk about climate change, we're talking about a specific phenomenon that is, hugely environmental, but nevertheless also social and political. And the lessons here won't apply entirely, but I think there's a lot to be drawn from this. And so the idea here of climate migration as adaptation, I think, is one that everyone will be familiar with, presented as an opportunity. But I think more recently, some of the literature is talking about how actually this depends on other power dynamics and economic dynamics. Not everyone is equally empowered to adapt, to migrate, and indeed, as Ritu was talking about, the mechanisms of debt that can be involved in that can entrap people in modern slavery or other similar forms of bondage. So we have this idea that vulnerability does not fall from the sky, or that resilience does not take place in a vacuum. And particularly the idea that I think is very important to bear in mind, and I think Ritu and others research speaks to this, is that climate change for many people, and many of these most vulnerable or vulnerabilized, as I would say, people, particularly in the global south, although not exclusively, the climate change is the latest in a long line of stressors contributing to their vulnerability. And this certainly came across very strongly for me in my research, when it felt that, and maybe perhaps with Wilma's talk a bit earlier as well, that I would ask about climate change and people would talk about the oil spills or the mines or the government or or prices for products. So they're dealing with a whole load of stressors. And particularly when I spoke with some Indigenous leaders, they didn't draw any particular distinction between the impact of climate change, for example, and the impacts of mining or oil extraction near their territories. For them, it was all of a piece. And if we look at it over a longer time frame, perhaps that is a fair point. And Taylor has the idea then that I would agree with, the vulnerability is relational, and that the capacity to adapt to climate change is a matter of power. So what he says is that we need to examine this vulnerabilization of groups within a local context. And so as one of the things that I set out to do in this research project, particularly I was interested in how the post-neoliberal turn in Latin America, or sometimes called the New Left, impacted on responses to vulnerability to climate change in the context of in contemporary slavery, in the context of climate change. So this was a series of broadly left-wing governments that were elected in the sort of early to mid 2000s, but many of which stayed in power or remain extremely prominent. And brought in and achieved a lot of interesting programs and reforms, not least the program that Shannon was talking about, which was not created by the Workers' Party, but was very much strengthened and advanced by them. So what was going on there, and to what extent could we say that these governments have acted to shift these power dynamics and as a result reduce vulnerability? So the case that I'll talk to you about today is that of Bolivia, which was one of these countries. And I visited Bolivia. I did 2 periods of field work in both Peru and Bolivia, and also did a short work placement in an anti-trafficking organization in Lima. And I conducted over 90 semi-structured interviews with state officials, with labor inspectors, with police and prosecutors, with NGOs, grassroots social movements, and academics. And you know, certainly when we look at Bolivia, it's a country that is threatened by climate change. It is, you know, ranked by the Notre Dame Game Index as the most at-risk country in South America, and one of the least prepared for the impacts of climate change. Particularly, a particular source of concern is water, and particularly the melting of glaciers. Until a few years ago, outside of La Paz, was the Chacaltaya Glacier was the highest ski resort in the world, and now it is basically just rock. And when large amounts of the population depend on glacier melt for their drinking water, for animals, and for irrigation, then this is obviously a serious problem. And in La Paz and its sister city El Alto in 2016, the region experienced a very severe water shortages. The impacts of climate change are pretty varied there. It is a country with different geographical and climatic landscapes, and so we see certainly water shortages, floods, very, very cold weather, but also rising temperatures, as Wilmer referred to, soil depletion and desertification. And in terms of the government then, you know, this was a government that was very much elected to reverse centuries of the exclusion of the majority in the country, very much dating back to colonization. And one of the key, I suppose, demands or promises also of the government was to address issues of power primarily through the redistribution of land and the titling of indigenous territories, and also the granting of some form of indigenous self-government called autonomies. And the government very much adopted indigenous symbolism and discourses, and also that of the Mother Earth as a legitimating discourse. And certainly did act in some ways to address exclusion and vulnerability. Wilmer mentioned earlier the passing of a very powerful anti-racism law. But again, the problem has been the failure to implement. Similarly, it acted to redistribute land, but most of the land that was redistributed or titled to indigenous people was worse land. The better land was preserved for larger landowners and agribusiness. And as we heard from Wilma, even that is being rolled back. Similarly, indigenous territories are increasingly being entered into with the government 2015 decree allowing for them to enter into protected areas to explore for oil and minerals. And they've also then used this language of what Godinez calls the compensatory state to legitimize these practices of increasing industrialized agriculture, to increasing other forms of extractivism like mining, like oil, by associating them with poverty reduction. So poverty has reduced in the country, but there is a big question, particularly now and in the future, as to at what cost of a short-term reduction when the environment is very much being sacrificed as part of this. And so, and another thing that's important to note then when it comes to these power relations is the government has managed a sort of a shifting alliances, and certain groups within society have emerged as being very powerful through supporting the government, particularly mining interests and large-scale export-oriented agriculture. So this brings us to, I suppose, an emblematic event in late 2015, which was the disappearance of Bolivia's second largest lake, Lago Popo, which was very much at the time presented by both local and national government, and also by some media as a sort of a natural event. And particularly when I say natural, obviously climate change is not natural, but not a locally occurring event, but actually something that was of global nature. But as Witt says, in fact, this was very much a predictable event. And the most obvious predictable nature of it was that 1 year before the disappearance of the lake in November 2014, there was a mass die-off, biodiversity die-off. Millions of fish died, and hundreds of birds. And this had a devastating impact on the Uru Maratus indigenous people that lived predominantly by fishing, although supplemented with other activities in and around this lake. The Uru are known as the hombres de agua, the people of the water, and yet what happened here devastated their livelihoods, pushed many, displaced large numbers, pushed them into different forms of vulnerability and migration, and even exploitation and potentially forced labor. So to just run through quickly, I suppose, what the wider picture was. So subsequent investigations have shown the impacts, particularly of definitely of climate change, warmer water temperatures, which reduced the fish stocks, high rains that led to and high temperatures leading to evaporation. But all of this was predictable because of the conditions that were permitted to create it, particularly the impacts of agriculture, both in Bolivia, but also on the Peruvian side of the border, diverting water for agriculture, and use of agrochemicals, soil erosion, meaning that sediment filled the lake, and particularly an area of the lake where the fish, deeper area where the fish would reproduce. And particularly mining. So not only from, there's a state-owned tin mine near here, which was using large amounts of water, 20,000 liters of water per day, and discharging toxic residue straight into the lake. And also other mining complexes nearby, including those run by multinational mining corporations. The Urus then, I'm saying here, were vulnerabilized before this event. So much of this goes back to a long way. When the Urus themselves in their oral history talk about the Spaniards and also the Aymara, another indigenous group, predominant indigenous group, very close to the government. They talk about them as the same as the Spanish. They don't distinguish. And the Aymara indeed invaded their lands in the 1930s. They also would have suffered through decades worth of mining pollution, which has gotten worse over the years, but has been going on for a long time before this government, with the impact on their health as well of eating contaminated fish. And then also sewage from nearby cities have degraded the water and have led to water shortages because so much water is being used for mining and agriculture. So all of this was already causing levels of migration, but much of it, some that Wilma mentioned earlier, more temporary, of going and returning back. But this event in 2015, 2016 has caused, according to a local indigenous rights organization, a much more permanent displacement. And so in response, there has been very little support given to the Urus, apart from some immediate emergency measures and training programs. Of the 14 houses in one community, only 4 are occupied now. And some have gone to across borders into Argentina and Brazil to work in textile factories, which are associated with labor exploitation. The men have been enganchados, as they say, entrapped with debt, particularly in the construction industry. Many of the women have migrated to the cities to go into domestic service. And even among the indigenous groups of the region, I mentioned the Aymara, who enjoy and have traditionally enjoyed more power as a bigger group. At that same local and indigenous rights organization, it was very awkward for them. They worked with both groups, so they told me that some of the Aymara have essentially are exploiting the Uru for a cheap source of labor, and one used the term modern slavery, although I'm not sure if it would be quite that extreme. But certainly this is a huge event that has vulnerabilized the indigenous Uru. It's created a new identity, which is the agro-minero, the farmer miner. So many of them are forced to work in mining. So as one member of an NGO, local NGO, said to me, the sons of the family are just helping to destroy the livelihoods of their parents. What's more, in the cooperative mines in particular, which is a big supporter of the government, there are no labor inspections, no state regulation, and it is told, at least apocryphally, that there are high levels of labor exploitation, and there probably would pass the test of forced labor. And so a local glaciologist has called this a genocide in slow motion. And the state response to finish has been, a mix of active and passive. They did declare an environmental emergency zone, and created a coordinator coordinating between 80 communities. There were plans made to build a tailings dam. Essentially, this lake was acting as a mining tailings dam, reservoir. But none of it has actually happened. Instead, the sort of things that have been happening have been, for example, at the Wanuni State Mine, where the mining company drills holes in the ground so the local community can go into the holes and see if they can remove some pieces of minerals and tin and so on, and that way feed their family by selling those. And so there's also EU funds, 40 million euros, that was given to help remediate the water here, and no one knows where that has gone. I suppose a more passive way, the government has more or less entered into what one person has described as a forbearance pact with these cooperative mines, who are very resistant to any sort of labor rights enforcement, and very resistant to any environmental regulation. So the Uru Matos have been essentially left to find their own form of survival. So to finish, I would say that these sorts of extractivisms are fundamentally incompatible with systemic climate action. You may get pockets and silos, but ultimately, if this is the basis of your economy, then it's not going to happen. And therefore, vulnerability, despite some efforts by the government, particularly in its early years, are doomed to fail. And therefore, we need to think more about the state and what the state responds to in terms of mediating vulnerability. And the first part of this is understanding these relations of power, which are being at the moment reproduced by these development models. And so we do also need to think of this in a globalized and a neo-colonial context. In places like Bolivia, this has been the history going back to the foundation and the conquests with Potosi, the hill of riches that devastated the landscape and used a system of forced labor and slavery. So we need to think about the state, but we also need to think about action beyond the state. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. Another very fascinating paper, great insight into the kind of role of the state, and as you've said before, where Indigenous voices are sadly kind of overlooked and sadly kind of not listened to in the way that they should. So ties in very neatly with a lot of our kind of previous kind of papers we've had today. So thanks very much again. I look forward to seeing how that research kind of develops over time. I think I'll ask you, Chris, to answer some questions in the chat, if that's okay. We're a bit pressed for time, but another very excellent paper. And I will introduce our third and final speaker of the day, who is Saphia Fleury, who will be exploring her work, Refugees from Environmental Change in Vietnam and Montserrat, Protecting People on the Move. Saphia is a third-year PhD student at the Wilberforce Institute, University of Hull. Prior to her research on environmental migration, Saphia worked for 12 years at the headquarters of Amnesty International. She published several books on international human rights law for Amnesty and specialised in the Middle East and North Africa region and fair trial law. She continues to advise Amnesty as a consultant and has co-authored Amnesty's annual State of World Human Rights report since 2008. Saphia is also a volunteer expert reviewer for the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, Saphia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James. I'm just going to try and share my presentation now. So, nope, that hasn't worked. Let me try again. How's that?
That's working fine for me.
Yep. Okay. Right. So my research asks the question, what protection gaps exist for environmental refugees and what will be the best mechanisms to fill these protection gaps? So my research is based on two historical case studies of mass migration, the post-Vietnam War boat people and the exodus from the Caribbean island of Montserrat due to the volcanic crisis in the 1990s. These locations face major threats from climate change today, as well as experiencing significant environmental damage in the past, both man-made and natural. During the Vietnam War with America, North and South Vietnam experienced massive environmental damage, including from bombing, chemical weapons, and the use of bulldozers to destroy farmland and forest. Through my research, I argue that this environmental destruction contributed to the mass migration of Vietnamese boat people after 1975. Today, the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam is one of the world's most at-risk regions from both climate change and other forms of man-made environmental destruction. Montserrat, a small British overseas territory in the Caribbean, has a history of natural disasters, including hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic activity. In the late 1990s, 2/3 of the island were rendered uninhabitable by a series of volcanic eruptions, and more than half of the population moved overseas. Today, Montserrat faces increased hurricane activity as a result of climate change, as well as risks of further volcanic activity triggered by extreme rainfall. My research relied on the analysis of oral histories and archival documents, as well as a limited number of interviews with practitioners and politicians, to understand the risks faced by those who migrated from these two locations during the 20th century. The purpose of this was to understand how people may migrate from these locations in the future, and the human rights violations that future migrants may face if protections are not put in place. So the framework for my research is eco-global criminology. This includes a horizon scanning stage where future harms and risks are mapped out, and in this case, this is the risks from climate change. Mapping these risks for Vietnam and Montserrat helps to predict both the types of migration that might take place from these locations as a consequence of climate change, but also the harms that people might face while they are migrating and resettling in third countries. The next step is an analysis of the legal frameworks that currently exist to protect people who are migrating away from environmental change and climate change, to see where the protection gaps are. My research particularly looks at the risks faced by child migrants. So these are some of the forms of exploitation that are currently faced by children who migrate because of environmental change and natural disasters. In my research on Vietnamese boat people, some of whom cited environmental reasons as a push factor in their migration, I found that child refugees had experienced some of these forms of exploitation. Many were exploited in refugee camps in the region, as well as facing various other hardships and human rights abuses on the journey. Many departed as unaccompanied minors or were separated from their family en route, increasing their risk of harm. Thousands of younger children were adopted by Western families despite having living parents in Vietnam. Some children reported child labour and poverty following resettlement in the USA, with these children frequently working long hours, some in exploitative conditions. Lingering trauma contributed to domestic violence, family breakdown, and mental health issues. The most harrowing accounts of exploitation and human rights violations, however, come from the survivors' tales of companions who never made it, children and adults who died at sea or were abducted, raped, or attacked. For Montserratian children who came to the UK following the volcanic eruptions of the late 1990s, the risks were different. Yet family separation, trauma, and poverty still feature in their experiences. Compared with the Vietnamese Burke people, whose journeys were irregular, many Montserratians were assisted to move to the UK and resettle here. Yet various human rights abuses have been recorded both before and after their journeys to the UK. And for those who were unable to migrate, Montserrat has seen a significant increase in sexual exploitation of children, as well as a steep decline in living standards since the eruptions. So bearing in mind this snapshot of the various risks, the question is, what can be done to fill the protection gaps faced by environmental migrants? Child migrants are protected by various international, regional, and domestic frameworks and mechanisms. However, these are undermined in various ways, leading to weak protection. Firstly, legislation is only effective if it is implemented, and for international law, that process normally starts with codifying it in the national laws of individual countries and reflecting these new laws in government policy. Implementing these laws and policies requires a functioning and fair judicial system and accountable law enforcement, as well as other state functions such as child protection officers, properly trained immigration staff, and an education programme that informs people of their rights. States fall at the first hurdle when they fail to ratify the original agreement, as the USA has so far failed to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the only country yet to do so. States may also opt out of particular clauses that they don't agree to. For example, until 2008, the UK reserved the right not to apply the Convention on the Rights of the Child to migrant children, only backing down in the face of considerable pressure from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and from child rights groups in the UK. Some rights, such as freedom from slavery or torture, cannot be deviated from under any circumstances. They apply even when states have not signed the relevant treaties. Why then are there still millions of child slaves worldwide, many of whom have migrated away from their homes because of environmental change? And why do children still die in their thousands each year on migration routes or face torturous practices at the hands of kidnappers, armed groups, or smugglers? There are numerous reasons, from the capacity of developing states to police the issue or provide alternatives for children and their families, to social practices that promote child labour and cultural concepts of childhood. A major cause of child migrant exploitation, however, is immigration policy. International law often challenges governments' desire to control their own borders and citizenship practices, meaning that, as in the example of the UK not applying the Convention on the Rights of the Child to migrant children, states may pick and choose to whom they grant certain rights. International agreements, such as the twin global compacts on refugees and migrants, aim to fill this gap, but struggle to address the challenges posed by environmental migration. In that case, why not draft a new treaty to protect the rights of environmental or climate migrants? Why not call them climate refugees and give them the same rights as people fleeing persecution, who are currently protected under the UN Refugee Convention? This would, in theory, allow safer passage to their new homes and sufficient protections on arrival to prevent them falling into the hands of exploiters and abusers. Two schools of thought have grappled with this question, sometimes described as minimalists and maximalists. Maximalists believe that climate change has a direct causative effect on decisions to migrate, whereas minimalists see migration as the result of multiple complex drivers, of which environmental change is but one factor. Drafting a new treaty specifically on the issue of climate migration makes more sense if you follow a maximalist position, since you can more readily identify those people who would classify as refugees. Just as the mass migrations following World War II led to the signing of the UN Refugee Convention in 1951, maximalists draw a straight line between climate change impacts and displacement, and call for an equivalent treaty that defines climate-displaced people and their rights. This process, the maximalists argue, would not only provide protection to potentially millions of at-risk people, but would also formally acknowledge the existence of climate displacement and allow displaced people to participate in formulating a solution. In addition, some argue that giving protection to environmental migrants would create a safer world for all, tackling the social upheavals and security concerns caused by mass migration. Finally, advocates for climate justice argue that since rich countries cause the problem anyway through their greenhouse gas emissions, they should take on the legal burden of climate refugees. Some scholars have even gone so far as to calculate exactly how many climate refugees each developed nation should admit, based on their historical carbon emissions. On the other side of the debate, minimalists contend that it is impossible to prove that a particular climate or environmental event caused a person to migrate, because there are so many other factors involved. And if you cannot prove a connection between the environment and migration, then why not create a treaty for economic refugees or education refugees or the "I just wanted a better life" refugees? Since human rights law entitles everyone to an adequate standard of living, why single out climate refugees as a special case? Jason Pobjoy argues that existing law is enough to protect everybody, so long as it is applied correctly. For example, the 1951 Refugee Convention should be sufficient to protect children in all modern refugee and migration situations because, as long as it is interpreted in line with current human rights law, its definition of a refugee would evolve to cover everyone in need of protection. However, legislation may not even be the best approach to this problem. Putting people in legal categories will always leave some out in the cold, and it's possible to have global migration governance that doesn't rely on treaty law. Moreover, rich states are never going to submit themselves to a treaty that prevents them being able to secure their borders against a potential mass migration from poorer countries. So what's the answer? Well, climate change, as the maximalists argue, will indeed be a push factor for migration. And in fact, multiple studies, and indeed some of today's presentations, show that it already is. People have left their homes in search of new livelihoods in the face of environmental change since time immemorial. There is no reason that they should stop simply because the cause of change is atmospheric rather than, say, volcanic or seismic. Yet the instances where cause and effect can be stated with absolute certainty are rare and limited mainly to sudden onset events with catastrophic impacts such as landslides or floods. Most people, by contrast, find their lives being ground down by a combination of lack of opportunity, discrimination, and marginalization, exacerbated by the fact that their ability to scrape a living from their immediate environment becomes harder every day. Would these people fit a new treaty definition of a climate refugee? International efforts would be better placed in using existing global rules and development opportunities to lift them out of their economic misery and sidelined existence. One existing treaty alone, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, would, if fully implemented, allow each country to progressively realise the rights of all its citizens to an extent that reduces massively the drive to seek a livelihood elsewhere. This covenant was adopted in 1966. If countries have not found the will to implement it fully by now, what's to say that they will bother to implement a new treaty on the rights of climate refugees? Of course, it will be impossible to completely remove the need and impetus to migrate. In the course of this century, swathes of land will become inundated with salt water, or become so dry that they can no longer support human life. In these cases, planned relocation schemes that have the input and consent of the community may allow safe and regular migration, while others may benefit from bilateral labour migration schemes that allow some family members to work in other countries and support their households in situ with remittances. This can help to counter some of the fears of social unrest, even conflict, arriving from a mass movement of millions of people with nowhere to go and no legal way to make a living. This is my last slide. So during the Vietnam boat people crisis, the Vietnamese government signed a unique agreement with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, called the Orderly Departure Programme. This agreement allowed UNHCR to assist hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people to leave the country by plane and be resettled elsewhere, reducing the numbers forced to take dangerous and irregular sea journeys. In my thesis, I question the motives of the Vietnamese government since the programme also allowed them to effectively deport thousands of undesirables from the country, whom they feared might present a challenge to the new regime's authority. However, the availability of safe passage undeniably prevented many deaths at sea and other human rights violations. Since then, no parallel agreement has ever been drawn up between UNHCR and another nation state. And following the crisis in Montserrat, the UK government eventually provided assisted passage to the UK for many of those who wished to leave the island, again preventing a host of problems associated with irregular migration. Although these two schemes were far from perfect, my research indicates that assisted relocation schemes that are carried out in consultation with the affected individuals are almost certainly more beneficial and less risky than irregular migration, and may prove a more effective way forward than the current legal migration framework or even a new treaty aimed specifically at climate refugees. Thank you very much. That's my presentation. I'm going to try and stop sharing now.
Thank you, Saphia, for a really interesting paper and discussing kind of the, I guess, the kind of long-standing gaps in a way of the kind of legal protections of climate change refugees and how there's still a lot of work to be done in order to make sure they have kind of legal parity with other kinds of refugees, and a very kind of fascinating kind of research project, and ties very neatly with our previous talk. I think we're out of time in terms of question time, but I want to thank again Saphia, Chris, and Ritu for their great papers, providing us with plenty of food for thought about the ongoing issues surrounding conflict, disaster, and migration. So I'll hand back to Chris and Saphia for their concluding remarks for today's conference.
Great, thanks very much, James. I'm not sure if Fran is there, if you want to join us as well. Hi, Fran.
Hi.
So, yeah, where's Saphia gone? Do you want to start us off, Saphia?
Someone mute, sorry. Okay. So we had a few things to discuss, including the outcome document. Sorry, I should just say a big thank you there to James for a fantastic job of chairing that panel at the end there. I know it's been a long day, everybody, and thank you for everyone who's managed to stay with us throughout the day, and to James for doing such a great job. And we will try and answer your questions in the chat that we didn't have time for. But I know that Fran wants to talk briefly about the outcome document that you've been flagging up in the chat all day long to people, and which has a few signatories already, so that's a great job. And then I think, Chris, did you want to talk about future collaborations perhaps, or next steps?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. Yes, hi. My name's Fran Witt, and I work at Anti-Slavery International as the Climate Change and Modern Slavery Advisor. And I just wanted to thank Chris and Saphia for this phenomenal day of insights and incredible analysis. And it's wonderful just to see how many organizations are beginning to think about the nexus between climate change and environmental degradation, and vulnerability to exploitation and different forms of slavery, as well as extreme forms of exploitation. It's just been such a rich day. We've covered so many topics, and I think there's going to be an awful lot of food for thought. But overall, it just seems to me that we've got the seed of a very significant network of organizations we can pull together to have some serious impact. And so really looking forward to building future work with all of you. So we developed an outcome statement based on the abstracts of the day today, specifically focusing on COP26. Obviously, the COP's coming up very soon. It's in November. And we saw this conference as an opportunity to put together a joint message to COP to highlight, first of all, that this is an issue that we think is absolutely vital and needs to be responded to by the climate policymakers and by the climate community. And I think, generally speaking, modern slavery is an issue that has been a blind spot in the climate world up until this point, and we as a community now are the ones who are beginning to change that around. But in the statement that you'll find in the chat, and I'll just copy it in again now, a few people have signed up already. It's basically highlighting the issues that we've talked about today about the increase of vulnerability. So how climate change is another level or another stressor that's tipping people into vulnerability and trafficking and modern slavery. And it needs urgent attention. And we're asking for a just transition very specifically. So thinking about what can governments do to ensure that people who are subject to exploitation because of the impact of climate change and climate injustice have recourse to remedy as well as finance for adaptation. So I'd really commend you to sign up to that. I know some of you would need to go away and check with your organizations whether that will be possible, but please do that. And we'd very much hope that you'd be able to use the statement yourselves when you're in the run up to the COP as well, to highlight this issue more fully through your networks and through your media outlets. So I hope that works, everyone, and really look forward to seeing a few more people sign up to that, and look forward to future collaboration with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fran. And yeah, I think that's an excellent statement. And certainly if you can see a way to supporting it, that would be great. And yeah, I mean, just to mention, I mean, from myself, I just want to thank well, Saphia, and again to mention both Wilberforce Institute and Anti-Slavery International, as well as my own university. And in terms of future collaboration, you know, I a bit like I mentioned in my presentation, there, you know, I see a lot of convergence around this issue of climate change and contemporary slavery, and possibilities for collaboration and sharing of information and knowledge. So you know, I don't think we have a specific academic publication in mind yet, but I think that that's something that could be explored between those who have participated today, or alternatively something with more of a, you know, of a general focus. The one thing that we have discussed coming out of today, I suppose two things. One would be to make the videos of the sessions available. I'm not sure, Saphia, if we know exactly where those will be available, but I guess we can inform everyone that's here.
Yeah, I think we'll be emailing everybody in a few days' time with a link to all of the videos, and also some of the other links that have been shared in the chat that you might not be able to access afterwards. So links to reports and to the outcome document and so on. So we'll make all those available to everybody who's joined later. Yeah,
and the other thing that we hoped to do from as an output from today was to put together a sort of a report of the conference itself, a summary report that would, you know, bring together the abstracts and some of the points that came across clearly from the different sessions today. Again, as a sort of a method by which to share the knowledge more broadly, and also then to give us, you know, sort of a baseline from which to work for maybe future collaborations. So we'll be reaching out to the different participants from today in the days ahead to see if hopefully they would be interested in that as a first step, as well as any other steps that they might have in mind. So yeah, I think that would be something that would be very a good first step in terms of this. Yeah, I don't know, Saphia, have you anything to add to that?
No, just thank you again, Chris and Fran and everybody who's helped us to organise this, and all of our chairs and all of our speakers and everybody behind the scenes who's helped us with the tech, and our two fabulous translators who've done a full day of simultaneous translation into French for those who need it. No, it's been a huge team effort, and everyone who's asked fantastic questions and contributed, just really, really grateful for you all being here and really making
we
this
should
a
mention
fantastic
Wilma
day.
Mendoza, our keynote speaker as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you everybody.
Yes, thank you very much.
We'll let you get on with your evenings now, evenings, mornings, wherever in the world you are.